There are stories so deeply etched into the bedrock of civilization, we mistake them for the earth itself. But what if that bedrock is fractured? What if a truth exists that realigns not just history, but the very foundations of faith? This is a journey not to the familiar halls of Rome or the shores of Galilee, but to the sun-scorched highlands of Africa, to the ancient monasteries of Ethiopia. Here, a passage of scripture guarded for centuries has finally been brought into the light. It is found, or perhaps too dangerous, for the world to know. The familiar story ends with an empty tomb and fleeting appearances. But for the disciples who witnessed it, the event was not an ending, but a terrifying, bewildering beginning. They saw a man they knew to be dead, now risen. It was a miracle that defied the laws of nature, and its implications were immediate, unsettling, and impossible to ignore. To understand the secret, one must first understand its keepers. In the remote mountain sanctuaries of Ethiopia, a unique order of monks has long served a single, sacred purpose. These were not simply men of prayer, they were living archives, human vessels for a protected truth. Chosen in boyhood, they entered a world of austere devotion. Their education was not one of philosophy, but of preservation. They learned Ge'ez, the ancient liturgical language, mastering the meticulous scrape of a reed pen on parchment, committing entire volumes of scripture to memory until the words were as much a part of them as their own breath. As centuries of turmoil washed over the land, invasions, schisms, and the relentless pressure of outside powers, these guardians made a choice. When libraries became targets and holy sites were threatened, they did not fight, nor did they hide their treasures in the cities. They vanished. Carrying the priceless manuscripts, they retreated into the unforgiving landscapes of the Ethiopian interior. They sought out cliffs where only eagles dared to nest, deserts that promised death to any army, and mountain peaks shrouded in near-permanent mist. These were not hermitages, they were fortresses of knowledge, chosen for their sheer inaccessibility. To enter these places was to accept a living death. It was a vow to sever all ties with the world below. No family, no return, no rescue. Illness and injury were faced alone. This was not seen as a sacrifice, but as a necessary transaction. Absolute isolation was the price of keeping the word untouched, pure, and safe from the revisions of men and the decay of time. Within these stone sanctuaries, a strict hierarchy was observed. While common scriptures were studied and copied, certain texts were deemed too sensitive. They were sealed within inner chambers, behind doors that most monks were forbidden to pass. Access was granted to a single appointed guardian, a keeper of the flame, who would pass the burden to one successor before his death. For generations, this knowledge was a secret whispered from one dying guardian to the next, a truth entombed in silence. Now, that silence has been broken. A story kept for millennia, under the weight of stone and vow, has been spoken aloud, forcing us to ask, what is the nature of a truth that must be hidden to survive? And what becomes of the world when it is finally set free? In a chamber hewn from mountain stone, a guardian kept his vigil. He lived beside the sacred texts, and from this post he never strayed. He was a living seal upon a vault of knowledge. When the years claimed him and his breath ceased, another was chosen. The watch was passed, the duty continued. The individual did not. This was but the first layer of a profound security. To reduce the risk of catastrophe, of fire, of theft, of conquest, the most sensitive wisdom was never entrusted to a single place. Monastic accounts describe a radical strategy of dispersal. The holiest of texts were painstakingly separated, their chapters and verses divided. One monastery, nestled in a remote valley, would hold a single section. Another, perched upon a windswept plateau hundreds of miles away, would hold the next. The system was a form of protection born from a deep understanding of human fallibility. An intruder, a thief, or a conquering soldier might breach one sanctuary and seize a manuscript, but what they held would be a fragment, a single piece of an unknowable puzzle. The complete teaching could not be reconstructed. Its power could not be twisted or misused by those who lacked the context, the discipline, and the reverence. The scripture was a key, broken into pieces and scattered across a continent, comprehensible only to those who knew the map. There were moments when this sacred duty demanded decisions that, even to the modern mind, appear extreme. If a manuscript was believed to have been corrupted, its translation flawed, its meaning altered, or its contents viewed by unauthorized eyes, it was not archived or corrected. It was condemned. In a form of sacred iconoclasm, the pages themselves were surrendered to the elements. They were burned, the ink turning to smoke, the words returning to ether. Or they were buried deep in the earth, a funeral for a truth that had been compromised. And for some teachings, the risk of the written word was deemed too great altogether. The most esoteric elements, whispers of resurrection, and the deeper mechanics of the universe were never committed to vellum or parchment. According to tradition, these passages were entrusted not to ink, but to the architecture of the human mind. Senior monks memorized them, syllable by syllable, cadence by cadence, forming a chain of living memory passed from one generation to the next. This knowledge was a fire cupped in the hands of a chosen few, given only to those judged ready to bear its light without being burned. It is even believed that entire sections were intentionally allowed to fade from this oral record. When the leaders of a generation looked out upon the world and saw it consumed by greed or war, they would make a silent, heavy choice. They would let a teaching die with them, judging that humanity was not prepared to receive it. It was a quarantine of wisdom, a belief that some truths, if released into an unready world, would do more harm than good. The men who undertook these tasks took vows with a full understanding of their cost. They prepared their minds and bodies for imprisonment, for torture, for the finality of death, all to protect the locations and the contents of their libraries. Their philosophy was absolute. Scripture was an echo of the eternal. The body was a temporary vessel. Their ultimate fear was not the cessation of their own life, but the misuse of a truth that was meant to outlive empires. Yet, while these monks retreated into shadow, hiding and preserving, a very different process was unfolding in other centers of the Christian world. There, leaders were not scattering texts, but gathering them. They were not preserving every word, but debating which words were worthy of preservation. They were engaged in the great and terrible work of selection, of deciding which books would form the canon and which would be set aside, demoted, and ultimately forgotten. Those choices, made in councils and scriptoriums across Rome, Alexandria, and Antioch, would define the Bible that most of the world knows today. But this accepted history conceals a profound anomaly. The Ethiopian Bible does not begin as a variation. It begins as a problem. It contains 81 books, and there is no historical moment, no council, no great discovery, where those additional books were added later or restored after being lost. The record shows something far more disturbing. While other traditions were reducing their scriptures, editing their collections down to a recognized canon, Ethiopia did not. Its collection remained whole. Nothing was removed. Nothing was corrected downward. This fact alone forces a question that strikes at the very foundation of biblical history. If other Christian traditions ended with fewer books, then something did not simply disappear everywhere through the fog of time. It was removed. The story ceases to be one of accidental loss and becomes one of deliberate exclusion. In the earliest days of Christianity, this disparity would have made perfect sense. There was no single monolithic Bible at the beginning. No fixed list existed. The faith was a constellation of communities, each relying on the texts they had received, the letters they had copied, and the Gospels they trusted. Accounts of Jesus' life circulated alongside law, prophecy, and apostolic instruction. In this fluid world, what mattered was not a stamp of approval from a distant council, but whether a text was read, spoken, and lived within the life of a community. Authority grew from the ground up, from the resonance of a text in the hearts of its believers. The quiet preservation in the Ethiopian highlands and the public curation in the heart of the Roman Empire represent two different philosophies of truth itself. One sought to protect a vast and complex library from the world. The other sought to give the world a clear and singular book. One feared misuse, the other feared ambiguity. And in the silent spaces between the books that were kept and the books that were discarded lies a history of belief that was written not only by what was remembered, but by what was consciously and irrevocably forgotten. In the sprawling landscape of early faith, there was no single book. There was, instead, a constellation of writings, a vibrant and varied library of sacred texts revered across disparate communities. From the shores of the Mediterranean to the heartlands of Mesopotamia, practice was local and authority was diffuse. No institution yet possessed the power to declare one final, universal version of Scripture, binding for all believers. But within the vast machinery of the Roman world, a new imperative began to emerge. An empire built on order demanded an orderly faith. Church leaders, grappling with theological diversity and political pressure, began to argue that unity required agreement. And agreement, they contended, could only be achieved through a deliberate process of selection, a process that, by its very nature, required exclusion. In the grand basilicas and tense council chambers of the empire, the work began. Lists were drafted, debated, and disseminated. Theologians argued over the provenance and purity of Gospels, letters, and apocalypses. Slowly, painstakingly, a consensus was forged. Some books were canonized, elevated to the status of divine word. Others, once read and cherished, were quietly set aside, relegated to the shadows of orthodoxy. This was not the work of a single day, nor a single decree. It was the gradual result of human decisions, made by men of growing institutional power, navigating a world where faith and politics were becoming inextricably entwined. Yet far to the south, beyond the reach of imperial edicts and the politics of Roman council route, early, carried not by legions, but by merchants and missionaries. Here it evolved, unfettered by the centralizing forces shaping belief elsewhere. There was no emperor demanding conformity, no distant patriarch demanding a uniform collection of texts. According to the deep memory of the Ethiopian Church, its communities simply continued to read the scriptures they had always known. The notion of discarding a holy book simply because a council in a foreign land had deemed it so was alien. No external force ever arrived with the authority to command them to stop. As a result, the Ethiopian biblical canon remained vast and uniquely inclusive, a testament to an older, more diverse textual world. These books were never treated as esoteric curiosities or forbidden knowledge. They were woven into the fabric of daily devotion. Their narratives were proclaimed publicly in the liturgy, their teachings were expounded from the pulpit, and their words were meticulously copied onto parchment by scribal hands, a sacred trust passed down through countless generations. This continuity is of profound importance. These were not texts unearthed from a desert cave centuries later, startling scholars with their existence. They were a living, breathing part of an uninterrupted religious tradition. For well over a millennium, they shaped theology, ethics, and the very soul of a people. Meanwhile, in the West, many of these same texts faded from memory. Their disappearance was not always a verdict on their authenticity. Often they were excluded because they posed difficult questions. Some complicated and increasingly streamlined theology. Some challenged the simple hierarchical models of authority being constructed. Others introduced cosmological concepts or spiritual beings that were difficult to control, explain, and contain within a hardening orthodoxy. Over time, this deliberate exclusion solidified into absence, and absence was mistaken for non-existence. What is unsettling is that this great forgetting and this great remembering were happening at the exact same time. As the churches of Europe were narrowing their scriptural horizons, the scribes and priests of Ethiopia were painstakingly preserving those very same works. The loss, therefore, was not a universal Christian event. The faith did not forget these texts everywhere. It forgot them in specific places, for specific reasons. This divergence, scholars now suggest, explains why Ethiopian Christianity can feel so unfamiliar to Western eyes. It is a faith that developed from a wider, more complex textual foundation. Ideas and narratives that became ghosts in the West. The detailed celestial journeys in the Book of Enoch, the epic conflicts of the Book of Jubilees, remained central to belief and identity in Ethiopia. This does not render one tradition correct and the other false. It reveals that their histories irrevocably parted ways. By the time the Protestant and Catholic canons were being finalized in the fires of the Reformation and Counter-Reformation, the Ethiopian canon was already ancient and settled in its own right. There was never a council where Ethiopia chose its 81 books in defiant opposition to anyone else. It simply never made the choice to remove them. It is a library built not on exclusion, but on preservation. A quiet, enduring monument to the worlds of thought that history elsewhere chose to leave behind. For centuries, a wall of skepticism stood between the highlands of Ethiopia and the centers of Western scholarship. Whispers of a lost library, of a canon larger and perhaps older than any other, were treated as little more than romantic folklore. An impressive claim, but a claim nonetheless. And in the halls of history, assertions mean little without evidence. That evidence locked away in mountain monasteries, remained beyond the reach of modern science. The dismissal rested on a single, powerful argument, an intellectual shield that deflected any serious inquiry. The Ethiopian manuscripts, critics contended, were simply too late to matter. They were seen as medieval echoes, beautiful but derivative copies, penned long after the core tenets of Christianity had been forged in the councils of Rome and Constantinople. As long as this chronology held, the content of the texts themselves, the unique books, the variant readings, could be safely ignored as provincial curiosities. That shield, however, was about to be shattered. After generations of profound hesitation, a reluctance born not of obstinance, but of a sacred duty to preserve irreplaceable artifacts from potential harm, the monastic authorities of Ethiopia began to permit scientific examination. The gatekeepers of these ancient traditions, fearing the very procedures that might validate their history, finally allowed the cold, impartial gaze of science to fall upon their most treasured possessions. The chosen instrument was radiocarbon dating, a process that listens not to tradition, but to the slow, immutable decay of atoms. It is an incorruptible witness. It does not measure the grandeur of a story or the authority of a church. It measures only the age of the organic material from which an object is made. To perform the test, a microscopic sample, a tiny wound, must be inflicted upon the parchment. For years, this act was deemed an unthinkable desecration. Now, it was to be the key. The moment of reckoning would arrive with the testing of the Garima Gospels. Housed in a remote monastery, these two lavishly illustrated volumes had long been considered archetypes of the late theory. Their vibrant artwork, so full of life and color, was confidently assigned by art historians to the medieval period, perhaps as late as the 11th century. They were beautiful, yes, but they were not early. They were not from the source. When the laboratory results returned, they were not a revision, they were a revolution. The analysis of the parchment and the binding placed the Garima Gospels between the 4th and 7th centuries. These were not medieval copies. They were artifacts from the twilight of the Roman Empire, created centuries older than the celebrated Latin and Greek codices that formed the bedrock of Western textual history. This was not a matter of mere antiquity. It was a matter of timing. These books were not produced after the foundational doctrines of Christianity had been settled. They were created during the very crucible in which Christian belief was still being formed. They were contemporary witnesses to the great theological debates, written while the list of accepted scriptures was still in flux, and while texts later excised in the West were still being read, copied, and revered. The long-held narrative of Ethiopia as a peripheral outpost preserving a late and diluted version of the faith no longer fit the evidence. It had been shattered by the data. The response from the world of scholarship was not a thunderous retraction or a series of public apologies. It was quieter and far more revealing. A subtle seismic shift began to occur in academe manuscripts, began to vanish from the lexicon of serious inquiry. Researchers acknowledged, often in carefully worded footnotes, that Ethiopia was now understood to preserve some of the earliest surviving Christian material known to humankind. This conclusion was not won through argument or persuasion. It was delivered by a laboratory. History is not always a story told by the powerful. Sometimes it is a whisper, preserved in mountain air, waiting patiently for a tool sharp enough to separate truth from assumption. In the end, the parchment itself was allowed to speak, and its testimony redrew the map of a faith. It was not simply the age of the manuscripts that sent a tremor through the halls of academia. It was what that age implied. If these Ethiopian texts were indeed so ancient and had been in continuous use for millennia, then the startling differences they contained could no longer be brushed aside as later corruptions. They were not a deviation. They were evidence of a Christian tradition that had blossomed in its ear. This realization struck at the very heart of long-held academic habits. For generations, a comfortable consensus had held sway. The great libraries and archives of Europe were seen as the sanctified heart of Christian preservation, the primary source from which all legitimate history flowed. African traditions, however ancient, were often relegated to the periphery, viewed as secondary, derivative, or altered by distance and isolation. The dating results from the Ethiopian highlands irrevocably complicated that tidy narrative. History, it turns out, is a fickle guardian. The European continent was a landscape of repeated upheaval. Wars, the flames of the Reformation, and the calculated destruction of libraries had created profound disruptions in the manuscript record. Texts were lost, burned, rewritten. In stark contrast, nestled in the high, secluded monasteries of Ethiopia, a different story was unfolding. Here, scribes maintained a tradition with far fewer interruptions, creating an almost unbroken chain stretching back to antiquity. Cautious voices were raised, of course. Age alone, they argued, does not confer authority, and this is undeniably true. But what great age does achieve is the dismantling of an excuse. It removes the convenient claim that these texts are too late, too distant from the crucible of early Christianity to matter. Once that shield of dismissal disappeared, a defense of the old Eurocentric view was no longer tenable. With authenticity established, the debate was forced to evolve. It could no longer circle the safe territory of when these texts were written. It had to confront a far more disquieting question. What, precisely, did these ancient, faithfully preserved scriptures contain that others, in their own histories, had chosen to forget? The answer was found in books that make the modern soul profoundly uncomfortable. Once the antiquity of the Ethiopian manuscripts was accepted, scholarly attention shifted to what they actually said. And that is where the true challenge began. Some of these texts describe a spiritual world that is violent, unstable, and deeply invasive. This was not a safe universe where good always wins cleanly and evil stays clearly marked within its boundaries. This was a cosmos where those boundaries were porous, where sacred rules were shattered, and where the damage spread in ways that could not be easily undone. Perhaps the most potent example is the Book of Enoch, preserved in its entirety almost exclusively within the Ethiopian tradition, while vanishing from the canons of the West. It's authored from Enoch, treating it as authoritative scripture. According to this ancient text, certain angels did not remain in their assigned celestial roles. They descended into the human world. They taught forbidden knowledge. They directly and physically interfered with human life. These beings are not presented as metaphors or abstract symbols for evil. They are described as concrete entities making conscious decisions, taking sides in mortal affairs, and unleashing real, tangible destruction. Their actions, born of cosmic rebellion, lead directly to an eruption of chaos, violence, and suffering on a massive, world-altering scale. The survival of these texts does more than rewrite a chapter of history. It forces us to peer into a vision of reality that was once central to faith, a world not of comforting order, but of cosmic struggle. It asks us to consider what we have gained in our tidy modern beliefs, and what profound, unsettling truths we may have chosen to leave behind. It begins not with a single act, but with a cascade. A celestial boundary is breached, and the consorike the very limits of their being. In doing so, they unleash upon the mortal plane knowledge that humanity was never meant to possess. A terrible, untamed power spreads faster than the wisdom required to wield it. And in its wake, violence is not merely a possibility, it becomes an inevitability. Corruption multiplies, not as a weed in a garden, but as a contagion in the blood. What emerges is a world where catastrophe is no longer an accident of fate. It is the calculated result of deliberate choices, a terrible synthesis of divine transgression and human ambition. This idea alone shattered the comfort of simple explanations, the solace found in blaming gods or demons for the darkness in the world. It suggested a shared, and therefore inescapable, complicity. These writings refuse to grant the reader the luxury of easily identifiable evil. Sin is not presented as a minor personal failing, a debt that can be erased through simple ritual or repentance. Instead, corruption is depicted as a pervasive force that enters through the very channels of human consciousness, through forbidden knowledge, through insatiable desire, and through the simple, devastating act of imitation. Humans are shown to be profoundly influenced by forces far beyond their comprehension, yet they are never absolved. They are held accountable for what they choose to do with the dangerous truths they have learned. To be misled, according to this unforgiving logic, is no absolution. To know a better path and choose the worse one carries with it a gravity, a permanence of consequence that cannot be undone. In this framework, innocence is a brittle thing, easily lost and never truly regained. Humanity is not portrayed as a cast of helpless victims awaiting a distant rescue. They are active participants in their own drama, capable of amplifying destruction with their choices or resisting it with their will. A single action matters at a structural level, its ripples spreading to touch families, to reshape communities, to define the fate of generations yet unborn. There is no guarantee that the damage will be repaired, not quickly, perhaps not ever. This chilling premise removes the assurance of a final, tidy resolution. It replaces it with the stark reality of permanent accountability. The spiritual world depicted in these books is equally disturbing. Power does not flow through a neat, predictable chain of command. Authority fractures. Celestial order collapses into factionalism and rebellion. Punishment is meted out with a terrifying severity, but restoration, the healing of the cosmic breach, remains profoundly uncertain. It suggests that even divine systems are fragile, capable of catastrophic failure when fundamental boundaries are ignored. This is a cosmos that cannot be easily summarized or controlled. It demands constant vigilance, relentless introspection, and a heavy burden of responsibility from anyone who dares to read its words. And it was here, in this demand for radical personal accountability, that these texts became dangerous to earthly institutions. A belief system so complex and morally demanding cannot be reduced to comforting slogans or a short list of prescriptive rules. It forces a constant, difficult meditation on influence, on consequence, on the subtle interplay between free will and external pressure. Interpretation becomes a deeply personal and therefore uncontrollable act. Obedience ceases to be automatic. Authority, stripped of its claim to absolute simplicity, becomes harder to enforce. Reports from early theological debates reveal a telling fear. The leaders and arbiters of doctrine did not fear these texts because they believed them to be false. They feared them because they knew them to be destabilizing. They complicated the assignment of blame. They stripped away the comfort of excuses. They placed the crushing weight of responsibility not upon abstract systems or distant scapegoats, but directly upon the shoulders of the individual. Managing a faith that demanded such effort, such unrelenting maturity, was a task that not every community could sustain. Over time, a profound discomfort with these ideas became a deliberate distance. Distance, in turn, curdled into silence. These books were not condemned in public squares or consumed by flame. They were simply no longer read. They faded from the liturgy, from the sermons, from the collective memory. And yet, even these texts, with their challenging visions of fallen angels, systemic corruption, and human responsibility, were not the most sensitive of the ancient traditions. They were but a prelude, a glimpse into a world of even deeper and more unsettling questions. For what is more disturbing than a forgotten truth? Perhaps only the reason it was buried in the first place. The architects of the faith chronicled miracles, transcribed sermons, and detailed a final, brutal execution. But they stopped short of the moment that defines Christianity itself. The true silence, the great unresolved mystery, begins not with a death, but with what came immediately after. These were the days the story rushed past. Across all four canonical Gospels, a strange and consistent pattern emerges. The resurrection dawns, a tremor of dawn, a stone rolled away from a hollowed-out tomb in the morning light. And then, almost as soon as life has triumphed, the narrative accelerates, hurtling toward a final departure. The shift is jarring. In one breath, the ultimate enemy, death, has been defeated. In the next, the victor is gone. The space between these 2 points, a period of some 40 days, is rendered in brief, fragmented, and hauntingly quiet strokes. The Gospels offer only scattered vignettes from this pivotal time. A fleeting recognition on a dusty road to Emmaus, a startling appearance in a locked room, a shared meal of broiled fish on a shoreline, a command to wait. There is no sustained discourse, no grand sermon to unpack the meaning of this new reality. There are no detailed explanations, no long instructions for the nascent church. Consider the Gospel of Matthew. Multiple, dense chapters are dedicated to the Sermon on the Mount, a meticulous record of parables and laws delivered on a Galilean hillside long before the crucifixion. Yet, it contains all post-resurrection appearances combined. This asymmetry is not merely a matter of literary style, it is a profound theological puzzle. The resurrection is presented as the central, non-negotiable event of Christian belief, the hinge upon which all of history turns. If mortality has been undone, logic, that silence raises an uncomfortable, almost heretical question. Why would the most influential teacher in history, now existing beyond the fear of reprisal or death, say almost nothing? Why hurry past the very summit of reveal most no direct guidance in the light of an empty tomb. This was not a gap that went unnoticed. The first generations of believers, grappling with this uneasy void, saw it as a fracture line in their understanding. According to historical records and the fierce debates that shaped early doctrine, this period between resurrection and ascension became a battleground of ideas. Some argued that profound teachings were indeed given, but never recorded for public consumption. Others, particularly in Gnostic circles, believed this was the time of a secret wisdom, an esoteric doctrine imparted only to an inner circle and deemed too potent for the uninitiated. What is clear is that this window of time mattered far more to the early Christians than it does to many later traditions. Over centuries, as the faith codified its beliefs, theological attention shifted. The cross became the climax, the mechanism of salvation. The resurrection was reframed not as a new beginning for teaching, but as a final, triumphant ending, proof of divinity before the ascension into heaven. Later theology focused intensely on the state of the soul before death and the promise of salvation after it. The 40 days in between were treated as a mere transition, a divine epilogue rather than a new chapter. That choice simplified the story, but it left an unresolved echo, a question mark hanging over the dawn of the faith. Yet in the highlands of East Africa, sheltered by mountains and an unwavering tradition, a different memory was preserved. The Ethiopian Orthodox Tewahedo Church, one of the oldest Christian communities in the world, took a radically different approach. According to their sacred accounts, texts existed that focused with piercing clarity on these very days. These writings were not devotional extras or apocryphal footnotes. They were considered profoundly sensitive material, a body of guarded knowledge detailing the instructions given by the risen Christ. They were preserved with meticulous care, separated from public liturgy, their contents a matter of advanced theological study. For this ancient tradition, there was no silence at all, only a period of profound instruction that other traditions had allowed to fade into obscurity. The question, then, is not merely what was said in those 40 days. The question is how such a memory could survive in one corner of the world, while for the rest of Christendom, the silence was allowed to remain. Perhaps the greatest truths are not those shouted from the mountaintops, but those whispered in the spaces between the lines, waiting for a different kind of listening. Within the stone-walled cloisters of Ethiopia's ancient monasteries, a peculiar silence has long held sway. Here, history is not merely written, but curated. According to the annals of monastic tradition, certain texts from a pivotal, yet obscured period were never meant for common view. They were transmitted under the strictest of covenants, their contents deemed too potent, too unsettling for open dissemination. These were not works to be freely copied by scribes in sunlit courtyards, nor were their lessons taught to assemblies of the faithful. Instead, they were preserved through meticulously controlled lines of succession, a chain of guardianship where each link was a solemn vow. Some manuscripts were sequestered alongside esoteric works already considered profoundly difficult. Others were filed with writings known to be theologically destabilizing, a library of shadows kept from the light. This curated absence in the historical record is unsettling not for its existence, but for its profound consistency. It is a gap that echoes across chronicles, a moment that should have been a lodestar of faith, yet was reduced to a whisper, a footnote. A period that should have anchored an entire epoch was, by a quiet consensus, passed over with haste. By the time modern scholarship began to trace the outlines of this void, the silence itself had become an artifact. It was no longer just an absence of information, but a presence, an architected quiet that spoke volumes. And when attention finally turned to the meaning of this quiet, every inquiry, every scholarly pursuit led back to the very material that had been so carefully kept out of sight. At the heart of this silence lies a single, explosive document, a translated resurrection passage. For centuries, this text existed in a state of suspended animation, copied, guarded, and restricted, but almost entirely unknown outside the Ethiopian highlands. That long stillness began to fracture in the early 2020s. In a landmark collaboration, international scholars and Ethiopian church authorities initiated a sweeping project to catalogue and preserve the nation's fragile manuscript heritage. It was a race against time, aided by an arsenal of modern technologies. High-resolution imaging peeled back the ravages of time, revealing characters faded to near invisibility. Digital restoration algorithms stitched together fragmented parchments, and sophisticated language models, trained on ancient ge'ez, began to decipher syntax and semantics once considered impenetrably complex. From this digital crucible, the resurrection passage emerged, and its divergence from canonical accounts was immediate and stark. It describes Jesus not as a fleeting spectral visitor, but as a corporeal presence. Tally reframes the entire post-resurrection narrative. It is no longer a story of brief merect, a sustained and deliberate final instruction. This is not a ghost offering cryptic comfort. This is a teacher holding one last, urgent seminar. What is most striking is what he does not do. According to the translated text, the familiar parables are gone. The moral allegories delivered to the masses before his death are not repeated. There are no gentle stories meant to soften a difficult message. Instead, he speaks with a chilling plainness. The tone is controlled, insistent, and unburdened by the need for metaphor. Having passed through the finality of death, his language is stripped of all artifice. His warnings, as recorded in the passage, are unnervingly specific. He speaks of a future where his name will be wielded as an instrument of power. He foretells the rise of leaders who will invoke his identity not to heal, but to build personal authority, not to guide, but to amass wealth, not to liberate, but to cultivate fear. This is not presented as a distant, abstract possibility, but as an inevitable corruption, a predictable trajectory of human ambition. Power, he articulates, will... Perhaps the most unsettling instruction concerns the nature of faith itself. Jesus, in edifices of stone and doctrine, are too often raised to replace the far more difficult work of inner responsibility. It is a profound critique of institution, a warning that the very organizations built to preserve his message could become the cages that confine it. The passage leaves us with a disquieting paradox. A sacred text preserved for millennia by a religious institution that contains a stark warning against the inherent perils of that very institution. It suggests that some truths are not meant to be enshrined in cathedrals, but carried quietly in the human heart, forever challenging the structures we build in their name. All systems in time decay. The architecture of belief, once vital and alive, becomes a brittle latticework of dogma. Titles multiply, rules harden into unthinking rituals. People, once guided by an inner compass, become dependent on external forms, mistaking the map for the territory. The focus of this ancient warning is not on the preservation of an organization, but on the fragile, sacred fire of the individual. The lens then turns inward, from the sprawling institution to the silent landscape of the human soul. It is here that the true vulnerability lies, not only to the grand, obvious acts of wrongdoing that history records, but to a far more insidious decay, a subtle corrosion that begins with the smallest of choices. Where the attention is placed, what the heart desires, which words are given voice, these are not trivial matters. They are the very architects of our inner world. Corrupt finds its way through the repeated focus on that which feeds fear, on that which inflates pride, on the endless hum of distraction that pulls the mind away from the present. Over time, this quiet erosion leads to a state the passage describes with chilling clarity, a spiritual death, while the body itself remains alive. This idea is presented without comfort, without solace. It describes a condition in which a person can still function, speak, and participate in the machinery of society. They can hold a job, raise a family, and be seen as a pillar of their community, yet be internally collapsed. The body remains, a vessel still moving through the world, an automaton performing its duties, but the interior landscape is a ruin. The light has gone out. The true danger, it insists, is not the cessation of breath. It is the hollowing out of the self while still walking, the curse of becoming an echo while still speaking. This condition, this emptiness, spreads not through edict or decree, but quietly, through the powerful currents of imitation and habit. It is a contagion of the soul, passed from one to another in the unthinking patterns of daily life. The protection it offers is not found in the comfort of ritual, nor in obedience to an external authority. The shield is awareness itself. The text elevates knowledge beyond mere information, defining it as an act of sustained, active attention. It is a mandate to stand guard at the gates of the mind, to watch the birth of a thought, to guard the door of one's speech, to recognize and control a desire before it hardens into the inescapable prison of habit. This is not presented as optional advice for a better life. It is delivered as survival instruction. According to the scholars who wrestled with its translation, this direct and unsheltered tone is precisely what made the passage so difficult to release. It offers no support for hierarchy. It provides no comfort for institutions. It places the burden of salvation and the terror of failure entirely upon the shoulders of the individual. That singular focus, that radical responsibility, may well explain why it remained hidden in the highlands of Ethiopia for so long. When this translated passage finally began to circulate beyond its ancient borders, the response was immediate, but it was a silent shockwave. There were no public debates, no official pronouncements. The first reactions, according to academics and church insiders, unfolded behind closed doors. They took the form of small, urgent meetings, of letters exchanged quietly between cities, of hushed conversations among theologians and authorities who understood with terrifying speed the implications of what the text truly said. The concern was not heresy in the classic sense. The passage did not deny the existence of Jesus. It did not question the resurrection. Instead, it did something far more dangerous. It redefined what resurrection meant. According to those who first reviewed the translation, it described resurrection not as a singular event promised only after death, but as a profound, transformative process that begins during a person's lifetime. Resurrection, it argued, was not a promise for the dead, but a possibility for the living, the conscious act of awakening from the spiritual death of distraction and fear. This single shift from a future reward to a present-day struggle created a seismic problem for any institution built upon the promise of a delayed salvation. For centuries, religious systems have relied on mediated salvation, the foundational idea that spiritual authority flows through official channels administered by a chosen few. This text bypassed the gatekeepers entirely. An idea had been set loose, one that suggested the kingdom of heaven was not a destination to be earned through an intermediary, but a state of being to be realized here and now through the grueling work of self-awareness. And in that suggestion lies a power that no hierarchy can fully contain, and a responsibility that many would rather not bear. For centuries, the architecture of salvation was built on a simple, powerful premise. Access was controlled. Forgiveness, meaning, and the final promise of redemption were commodities dispensed through recognized structures, through sanctioned offices and sacred rules. The celestial ledger was kept by an earthly authority. But a dangerous idea began to surface, one that threatened to dismantle this entire edifice. It proposed that resurrection was not a future event, a reward granted by an institution for a life of obedience. Instead, it was an internal condition, a state of being accessible in the here and now. From an institutional point of view, this was nothing short of seismic. A system built on the fulcrum of permission and ritual cannot function if its subjects no longer need to ask. When clarity and inner peace are not mediated by a priest or a bishop, fear loses its currency. Authority becomes a hollow echo. This subtle shift in perspective altered the very function of resurrection as a tool of governance. If it is not something granted later, but something that begins internally through awareness and responsibility, the levers of control begin to fail. The promise of future reward loses its urgency. Compliance, secured for generations by threat and hope, becomes dangerously unreliable. Here we find the root of the alarm that would ripple through any empire aligned with a state religion. Empires require populations that respond predictably to symbols, to authority, to consequence. A people who believe they can find stability without an intermediary are a people who cannot be easily managed. The most unsettling element, however, was not a theological disagreement. It was a warning, a prophecy that the gravest danger would not come from the enemies of the faith, but from within its own hallowed walls. From the very institutions that would use the name, the symbols, and the authority of their founder to gather power unto themselves. The text does not frame this as a mere possibility. It is presented as an inevitable outcome. In this framework, hierarchy itself becomes evidence of decay. Titles become warning signs, and the more power an institution claims, the more perfectly it fits the profile of the predicted corruption. Suddenly, the debate was no longer about accuracy. It was about control. In the closed chambers of power, conversations reportedly turned to stability, to unity, to the sheer challenge of governing belief if such teachings were to spread. Limiting this knowledge was not framed as censorship, but as protection, a necessary shield for a populace believed to be unprepared for such a profound responsibility. In the end, the established order did not fear an incorrect belief. It feared something far more revolutionary, a people who could govern themselves.